The flickering torchlight casts long, dancing shadows across the cobblestones, illuminating not a festive street, but a scene of chilling anticipation. Imagine, if you dare, a town where the most sought-after tickets were not for a grand opera or a thrilling play, but for the agonizing spectacle of a child suffering. A place where the screams of the innocent were drowned out by the roar of the crowd, not in anger, but in perverse delight. This is not a nightmare, not a work of fiction, but a terrifying echo from a shadowed corner of our past, the town where children were legally tortured for entertainment. Prepare yourself, because some pages of history are painful for a reason. Before we descend deeper into this abyss, if the chilling reality of hidden histories fascinates you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Painful Pages, and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us unearth these darkest chapters of humanity, ensuring that even the most uncomfortable truths are not forgotten. Our journey takes us to the forgotten corner of the Anserian Plains, to a place once known as Viridia, nestled between the whispering forests of the Blackwood and the unforgiving crags of the Mournfang Mountains. Viridia was, for centuries, an anomaly. It was not a sprawling metropolis or a strategic stronghold, but a self-contained community, isolated by its geography and, as we shall see, by its morality. Its isolation was not merely physical. It was an ideological quarantine, a festering wound on the conscience of the wider world that for too long remained unnoticed, then ignored, and finally, by some, even envied. Viridia was born of a peculiar confluence of circumstances, a rich vein of mineral deposits beneath its harsh soil, a deeply entrenched and peculiar folk religion, and a ruling council whose grip on power was absolute, their interpretations of law and order a radical departure from any semblance of civilized society. The land itself seemed to conspire with the town's grim destiny. The soil, though rich in resources, was unforgiving, yielding meager crops. The winters were brutal, long, and isolating. Survival demanded a unique resilience, a hardening of the spirit that, in Viridia, manifested as a terrifying desensitization to suffering. This wasn't merely a town. It was an enclosed ecosystem of escalating cruelty, where the human capacity for indifference blossomed into a monstrous flower. The economic engine of Viridia was primarily its mining operations. From its deep mines, valuable ores, particularly a unique vein of what they called gloomstone, a phosphorescent mineral used in advanced metallurgy and arcane practices, were extracted. This resource brought significant wealth, but also attracted a specific kind of labor, the desperate, the indentured, and the orphaned. Viridia's laws, born of this isolation and economic need, evolved into a framework that prioritized order, obedience, and the peculiar interpretation of justice over compassion or basic human rights. Their legal code, known as the Code of the Bleeding Heart, was a labyrinthine document filled with archaic pronouncements and chilling precedents, all cloaked in a veneer of religious piety and communal well-being. It was within this twisted, legal framework that the unimaginable began to take root and flourish. But how did such a grotesque practice, the legal torture of children for entertainment, come to be? It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic shift, but a gradual, insidious erosion of empathy, a chilling descent into the normalization of cruelty. The initial seeds were sown in the lean years, during a series of devastating famines that plagued the region. Centuries ago, resources were scarce, and the Viridian Council, under the guise of resource management and social purification, enacted draconian measures. Children who were deemed burdens, the sickly, the orphaned, those from families unable to pay their civic dues, were the first to be targeted. Initially, their punishment was simply forced labor, often in the dangerous mines under the harshest conditions. This was rationalized as teaching discipline and contributing to the common good. The public, hardened by famine and fear, largely accepted it. They had to. Dissent was met with equally severe public disciplinary actions. As the famines receded and the mining wealth grew, Viridia's population swelled, attracting an influx of opportunists, exiles, and those seeking to escape the stricter moral codes of other realms. This new influx, combined with the generations already desensitized by the prior harsh laws, created a fertile ground for further moral decay. The punishments for minor infractions, even those committed by children, began to escalate. Petty theft, insubordination, even excessive noise were met with public floggings. The council, ever keen to maintain absolute control and distract the populace from their own grim lives, discovered a chilling side effect. These public displays of suffering were effective deterrents. Yes, but they also garnered an unexpected form of attention, a morbid fascination from the spectators. People would gather, not just out of civic duty, but out of a perverse curiosity, a desperate need for diversion in their otherwise bleak existence. This was the critical turning point, the moment when punishment began its terrifying metamorphosis into entertainment. Slowly, subtly, the public displays shifted. They were no longer solely about justice. The council, shrewd and cynical, began to realize the social utility of fear and spectacle. They started to introduce games, trials of endurance, contests of pain. Children, still the most vulnerable and easily controlled, became the primary subjects. The code of the bleeding heart was reinterpreted, then explicitly amended, with clauses that allowed for corrective spectacles for the moral instruction of the young and the edification of the public. These spectacles were presented not as torture, but as lessons, demonstrations of will, or even purification rituals. The terminology itself was a weapon, sanitizing the horror, making it palatable to a populace already primed for acceptance. The unique gloomstone also played a role. Its subtle, mind-altering properties, when consumed or even simply inhaled over long periods in the mines, were believed by some scholars to subtly dull the senses, flatten emotional responses, and amplify a perverse thrill for extreme stimulation. Whether this was true or merely a self-serving myth, it became another convenient excuse for the collective moral blindness that gripped Viridia. Over generations, the line between legal consequence and public amusement blurred entirely, erased by the collective indifference and active participation of a society that had lost its soul, one agonizing spectacle at a time. Now, let us turn to the horrifying details of these spectacles, the forms of entertainment that took place in Viridia. These were not mere spontaneous acts of cruelty, but highly structured, meticulously planned events, each with its own specific rules, designated roles, and anticipated outcomes. The primary venue for these displays was the Arena of Silent Tears, a large, circular pit carved into the heart of the town, surrounded by tiered stone seating. It was designed to maximize visibility, ensuring that every citizen, from the highest councilor to the lowliest miner, could partake in the grim festivities. The air in the arena was perpetually heavy with the scent of fear, iron, and a strange, cloying incense burned to purify the space before each event. The games themselves varied in complexity and duration, but all shared a common thread: the systematic infliction of pain designed to break the will, not necessarily to extinguish life, but to demonstrate absolute power and control. Children, typically between the ages of 6 and 14, were the primary performers. Their selection was a perverse lottery. Sometimes it was for a genuine, albeit minor, infraction of the increasingly absurd code of the bleeding heart. A dropped market basket, a whispered comment, a stray animal. More often, it was simply based on availability. Orphans, children from indebted families, or those whose parents had fallen out of favor with the council. There was even a system where families could offer one of their children for a period of civic service in exchange for clemency on debts or favored positions in the mines. The desperation, the sheer terror that must have gripped those families is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine the choices they faced. This was not just about the children, but about the insidious ways the system manipulated and broke every single member of the community. One common spectacle was known as the weeping willow. A child would be tied to a gnarled, leafless tree stump in the center of the arena. For hours, sometimes days, they would be subjected to a slow, controlled form of sensory deprivation and exposure. They would be blindfolded, their ears plugged, and then left exposed to the elements, whether the blistering sun or the biting winds, while the crowd watched. Periodically, a keeper of tears, a robed figure, would approach, remove a single plug from the child's ear, and whisper a terrifying tale of their perceived failings, or the failures of their family, before replugging it. The goal was to elicit tears, to break their composure, to force a public display of raw emotion for the crowd's consumption. The longer the child resisted, the more intense the whispers, the more varied the weather, until inevitably they would break, their silent sobs echoing through the unnaturally quiet arena. The crowd, in a chilling display of appreciation, would then sigh in collective satisfaction, their perverse hunger momentarily sated. Another, more physically demanding spectacle was the Trail of Thorns. Here, a child, barefoot and clad, only in thin linen, would be forced to navigate a maze of sharp, thorny bushes and jagged stones laid out in a section of the arena. They were not allowed to cry out, to show any overt signs of pain. Overseers, armed with long staves, would prod them forward, ensuring they did not deviate from the torturous path. The entertainment came from the child's desperate attempts to maintain a stoic facade while their feet and shins were lacerated. Bets were often placed on how long they could maintain their silence, or how many steps they could take before succumbing to a whimper. The victors, those who endured the longest or showed the least reaction, were not celebrated for their resilience, but merely seen as having provided the best show. Their reward was merely to be taken away, often with permanent physical damage, to be replaced by the next unfortunate soul. Perhaps the most grotesque and psychologically devastating game was the echoing confession. This spectacle was reserved for children accused of more serious crimes, often fabricated or gross exaggerations of minor missteps. The child would be placed in a soundproofed chamber, visible to the audience through a large, reinforced glass panel. Inside, they would be subjected to relentless, disorienting sound and light patterns designed to induce hallucinations and paranoia. Their parents or other family members would then be brought into the arena, forced to watch their child's torment. A voice, amplified through unseen speakers, would begin to list the child's sins, and more insidiously, the alleged sins of their family. The ultimate goal was to break the child's will to the point where they would falsely confess to anything, often implicating their own parents or siblings, in exchange for the torment to stop. The entertainment was derived from watching the child's psychological collapse, their desperate pleas, and the forced betrayal of their loved ones. The crowd, in a chilling display of justice, would roar approval as a child, broken and sobbing, would confess, thus proving the council's wisdom and the rightness of their cruel laws. These spectacles were not random acts of sadism. They were systematic, ritualized performances. Each one served a purpose: to reinforce the council's absolute power, to desensitize the population to suffering, to instill fear, and to provide a macabre form of communal bonding over shared, grotesque entertainment. The very infrastructure of Viridia was built around these horrors, making them an integral, inescapable part of daily life. The arena of silent tears was as central to their town as the marketplace or the temple. It was where the social fabric was woven, stitch by painful stitch, with the threads of cruelty and the dye of despair. How did an entire society, or at least its dominant culture, come to not only tolerate, but actively participate in such horrors? The psychology of the Viridian populace is a complex and deeply disturbing subject, a testament to humanity's capacity for both resilience and depravity. It wasn't a universal embrace of evil, but rather a chilling mosaic of fear, apathy, ingrained belief, and for some, genuine, twisted enjoyment. Firstly, fear was a paramount motivator. The council's rule was absolute, enforced by the chillingly efficient watchers of the code, a brutal militia that showed no mercy. Dissent, even a whispered complaint, was met with public humiliation, physical torment, or, in severe cases, the dreaded disappearance, where individuals simply vanished, their fates never known, their names erased from all records. This pervasive climate of terror ensured compliance, but it also fostered a deep-seated suspicion among neighbors, eroding any sense of community and preventing organized resistance. People learned quickly that to survive, one must conform, one must not question, and one must at least appear to approve. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. As more people outwardly comply, it reinforces the perception that the practices are normal or accepted, making it even harder for the few dissenters to speak out. The silent majority becomes complicit through their silence, not necessarily through their active participation or belief. Secondly, the Viridian folk religion, a perversion of older, more benevolent faiths, played a crucial role in legitimizing the atrocities. The cult of the cleansing fire, as it was known, taught that suffering, particularly that of the innocent and impure, was a necessary process for the spiritual purification of the community. Children, especially those with any perceived blemish or weakness, were deemed vessels for the communal impurities. Their pain, therefore, was not seen as cruelty, but as a sacred sacrifice, a cleansing ritual that ensured the prosperity and spiritual well-being of Viridia. The arena of silent tears was not just an entertainment venue. It was, in the eyes of the cult, a temple, a sacred space where the divine will was enacted. Priests, robed in black and adorned with symbols of weeping eyes, presided over the spectacles, offering prayers and blessings, further sanctifying the abuse. This religious indoctrination was deeply ingrained from birth, taught in every home and public gathering, woven into their songs and stories. It created a powerful moral justification, allowing people to reconcile the horrific acts with their own sense of righteousness. If the gods demanded it, if it was for the good of all, then it must be right, no matter how profoundly disturbing it appeared to an outsider. Thirdly, there was the element of desensitization and normalization. When cruelty becomes a daily occurrence, a part of the cultural landscape, its shock value diminishes. For generations born and raised in Viridia, the screams from the arena, the public displays of torment, were simply facts of life, as common as the changing seasons. They never knew a world where such things were not permissible, where empathy was a celebrated virtue rather than a dangerous weakness. Children played games mimicking the spectacles, unaware of the horror they were simulating. The line between entertainment and torture dissolved completely. This normalization was further exacerbated by a curious form of social bonding. Attending the spectacles became a communal activity, a shared experience. People would discuss the performance afterwards, critique the child's endurance, or praise the skill of the tormentors. It became a morbid form of gossip, a way to connect with neighbors, reinforcing the idea that this was just how things were done in Viridia. This collective participation, the shared secret of their depravity, created a twisted sense of solidarity, making it even harder for anyone to break free from the cycle. Furthermore, the council actively encouraged a us versus them mentality, painting outsiders as soft, weak, and morally corrupt, incapable of understanding Viridia's enlightened ways. This isolationist rhetoric further cemented the internal justification for their barbaric practices. The citizens of Viridia were not inherently more evil than anyone else. They were the tragic product of a meticulously crafted system designed to strip away their humanity, one excruciating entertainment at a time. And what of the children themselves, the direct victims of this institutionalized terror? Their stories, though largely unrecorded in any merciful detail, speak volumes through the chilling implications of Viridia's practices. The children targeted were, by design, the most vulnerable, the orphans whose families had succumbed to famine or disease, leaving them with no protectors. The progeny of families burdened by insurmountable debts, forcing parents into unimaginable sacrifices, and those simply deemed unfit or troublesome by the all-powerful council. There was no recourse, no appeals process, no external body to intervene. From the moment the child was marked, their fate was sealed within the confines of Viridia's twisted justice system. The psychological toll on these children must have been cataclysmic. Imagine living in a world where your innocence is not a shield, but a target, where the adults who should protect you are either complicit, terrified, or actively participate in your torment. The constant fear, the pervasive sense of helplessness, the utter betrayal of every societal norm would have fractured their young minds. Many would have suffered from extreme post-traumatic stress, enduring nightmares, flashbacks, and a profound inability to trust anyone. Their emotional development would have been severely stunted, replaced by a constant vigilance and instinct for survival honed by unimaginable pain. Physical injuries, though not always fatal, were common and often permanent. Lacerated skin, broken bones, dislocated joints, chronic pain, these were the lasting souvenirs of their performances in the arena of silent tears. Many would have developed infections, leading to disfigurement or even death. For those who survived the spectacles, their lives were far from over. They were often discarded, sent to work in the harshest parts of the mines, or left to wander the streets as broken husks of their former selves. The council, in their perverse wisdom, understood that a living, broken testament to their power was often more effective than a dead one. These walking wounded served as a constant reminder to the populace of the consequences of failure or dissent. They were living warnings, their silent suffering a daily sermon on obedience. Even for those children not directly chosen for the spectacles, the psychological impact was profound. Every child in Viridia lived under the shadow of the arena. They witnessed the torment of their peers, their siblings, their friends. They were indoctrinated from birth into the cult of the cleansing fire, taught that this suffering was necessary, even holy. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. How does a child reconcile the inherent cruelty with the message that it is good and just? Many would have suppressed their natural empathy, learning to harden their hearts as a defense mechanism. Others would have lived in constant terror, forever walking on eggshells, desperate to avoid any misstep that could lead them to the arena. The games they played, mimicking the tortures, were not just innocent play. They were a desperate attempt to normalize, to control the uncontrollable, to process the horrors they witnessed daily. The generational trauma would have been immense, creating a society perpetually scarred, incapable of true joy or genuine compassion. Viridia was not just a town that tortured children. It was a town that broke them, body and spirit, leaving behind a legacy of pain that echoed through every cobblestone, every shadowed alley, and every hollow, haunted gaze of its inhabitants. The children were not just victims of the spectacles. They were victims of the entire society that allowed, justified, and profited from their agony. Their silent screams reverberated across generations, a chilling testament to humanity's capacity for systemic evil. Outside the cloistered walls of Viridia, the whispers began. In neighboring settlements, in the burgeoning trade hubs, and even in the distant courts of the great kingdoms, rumors of Viridia's peculiar practices started to circulate. At first, they were dismissed as exaggerated tales, morbid fictions, spun by travelers and merchants. Who could believe such a thing? Legalized torture, especially of children, for public amusement? It sounded like the fevered dream of a madman, not a reality. Yet the persistent whispers, often accompanied by disturbing accounts from the few who managed to escape Viridia's iron grip, slowly began to chip away at the skepticism. One tale, often repeated, spoke of a merchant who witnessed a weeping, willow spectacle, fled in horror, and spent the rest of his days haunted by the silent sobs he claimed to have heard. Another recounted a band of mercenaries who, seeking their fortune in Viridia's rich mines, deserted in disgust after seeing a trail of thorns, their moral compasses surprisingly intact despite their hardened professions. These stories, fragmented and sensationalized, eventually reached the ears of those in power. However, the reactions were varied and often, depressingly, self-serving. Some minor lords, more concerned with their own coffers than with morality, saw Viridia's isolation and wealth as an opportunity. They might have quietly sent envoys, seeking trade agreements for the valuable Gloomstone, implicitly accepting Viridia's internal affairs in exchange for economic benefit. They were pragmatic, or perhaps simply lacked the courage to condemn. More powerful kingdoms, with their complex political landscapes and internal struggles, faced a difficult dilemma. Outright military intervention would be costly, would disrupt trade, and could potentially spark a wider conflict. There were also questions of jurisdiction. Viridia, though small, was fiercely independent and claimed ancient rights to self-governance. Accusations, no matter how credible, needed proof, and Viridia was notoriously insular, making it difficult to gather direct evidence. Diplomacy was attempted. Emissaries from various kingdoms were sent, bearing letters of concern and thinly veiled threats. They spoke of humanitarian principles, of moral outrage, of the common decency that should bind all civilized peoples. But the Viridian Council, arrogant in their isolation and secure in their wealth, dismissed these appeals with disdain. They cited their ancient laws, their unique spiritual beliefs, and their right to self-determination. They often retorted with accusations of hypocrisy, pointing to the less overt, but no less brutal, forms of exploitation and injustice that existed within the very kingdoms that dared to judge them. Their arguments, though morally bankrupt, were legally sound within their own twisted framework, and difficult to challenge without resorting to force. Religious organizations, particularly the more widespread and benevolent faiths, did issue condemnations. Priests and holy orders declared Viridia a place of heresy and abomination. They called for crusades, for divine intervention, for a cleansing of the darkness that had taken root there. However, without the backing of powerful secular rulers, these calls often remained just that, calls. Some brave individuals, humanitarians, and zealous missionaries did attempt to infiltrate Viridia, hoping to rescue children or expose the truth to the wider world. Many never returned. Those who did returned broken, their tales so horrifying that they were often disbelieved or dismissed as madness. The sheer scale of the institutionalized cruelty, the complete lack of empathy within Viridia, was simply too alien, too monstrous for most to fully grasp. Thus, for many long, agonizing generations, Viridia remained a dark secret, an open wound on the conscience of the world, tolerated or perhaps simply ignored by those who held the power to intervene, but lacked the will, or perhaps the capacity, to truly comprehend the depths of its depravity. Its continued existence was a grim testament to the world's indifference, a chilling example of how easily a society can lose its moral compass, and how difficult it is for outsiders to right a wrong that has become so deeply entrenched. For centuries, Viridia continued its grim traditions, an isolated bastion of legalized suffering. But nothing, not even the most entrenched evil, lasts forever. The decline of Viridia was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing process mirroring the very suffering it inflicted. There were several contributing factors, each a thread in the unraveling tapestry of its depravity. Firstly, the Gloomstone mines, the very source of Viridia's wealth and isolation, began to run dry. The veins grew thinner, the extraction more difficult and dangerous. As the primary economic engine faltered, so too did the town's ability to maintain its elaborate system of control and its perverse spectacles. The wealth that had once attracted opportunists and deterred external intervention dwindled, making Viridia less appealing and more vulnerable. The council, desperate to maintain their power, increased taxes, tightened control, and escalated the severity of punishments, inadvertently sowing the seeds of internal unrest. The desperation of the populace, now facing both external condemnation and internal economic hardship, began to outweigh their ingrained fear. Whispers of rebellion, once suicidal, grew louder. Secondly, the centuries of psychological and physical torment took their toll on the Viridian populace. Generations of living in fear, of suppressing empathy, of witnessing unremitting cruelty, had created a deeply scarred and ultimately dysfunctional society. Birth rates declined as people, either consciously or unconsciously, resisted bringing children into such a world. Mental illness was rampant, though unrecognized. The capacity for innovation, for genuine community building, for any form of progress, withered under the weight of their collective trauma. The town became a shell, economically stagnant and socially rotting from within. Even the cult of the cleansing fire lost its fervent grip. As conditions worsened, as the purification rituals seemed to bring only more suffering and less prosperity, faith in the twisted doctrines began to waver. People started to question, quietly at first, then more openly, whether the divine truly sanctioned such agonizing sacrifices. The priests, once powerful figures, found their sermons met with increasing cynicism and apathy. This erosion of the ideological backbone further destabilized the council's authority. Thirdly, the outside world, though slow to act, was not entirely static. As other kingdoms grew stronger, more interconnected through trade, and perhaps marginally more enlightened, the anomaly of Viridia became increasingly intolerable. The persistent tales of its atrocities, once dismissed as exaggeration, gained more credence as the world shrank and communication improved. A new generation of leaders, less concerned with the old political rivalries and more attuned to emerging concepts of human rights and international morality, began to view Viridia not as a mere nuisance, but as an affront to civilization. An alliance of powerful, burgeoning nations, led by a newly unified kingdom known for its strong humanitarian principles, finally took decisive action. They didn't just send diplomats, they sent an ultimatum. With Viridia's economic power diminished and its internal cohesion fractured, the council found itself isolated and vulnerable, unable to resist the combined might of an increasingly unified and morally outraged world. There was no grand battle, no heroic charge. Viridia, stripped of its resources and its internal justifications, simply collapsed under the weight of external pressure and internal decay. The council was deposed, their code of the bleeding heart publicly burned, and the arena of silent tears dismantled, its stones scattered to the winds. However, the legacy of Viridia's horrors was not easily erased. The town itself, though renamed and rebuilt, bore the scars of its past. Generations of Viridians struggled with the psychological aftermath, with the trauma of what their ancestors had done and what they themselves had been forced to endure or witness. It took centuries for the whispers of its dark history to fade, for the collective shame to lessen. The tale of Viridia serves as a chilling testament, not only to humanity's capacity for unimaginable cruelty, but also to the insidious ways in which power, fear, economic desperation, and distorted belief systems can converge to normalize the most heinous acts. It reminds us that empathy is not a given, but a fragile quality that must be actively cultivated and fiercely defended. It teaches us that the line between justice and torment, between entertainment and atrocity, can be horrifyingly thin, and that without constant vigilance, any society, given the right set of circumstances, can lose its way. The screams of Viridia's children may have been silenced, but their echoes should forever serve as a warning. The most terrifying monsters are not those from myth, but those born from the depths of human indifference. And sometimes, the most painful pages of history are the ones we need to read the most carefully, so that we may never, ever repeat them.